we were talking about the nature of ethics and whether ethical judgments could be said to be true or false, or whether they are rather something that is subjective, something like a matter of taste. And I discussed ethical subjectivism and suggested that it's odd that we do seem to be concerned to argue about ethics, to persuade other people, to advance reasons, to defend our ethical positions, and we don't do that about matters of taste. So that's one way in which ethics seems at least not to be purely subjective. So some people then shift to say, well, okay, ethics is not just a matter of individual subjective tastes. Don't we know that ethics is related to culture? The different cultures have different ethical views. And so perhaps ethics is neither individually subjective nor objectively true or false, except insofar as it's relative to culture. So this is a position that is sometimes called cultural relativism or ethical cultural relativism, which is still not what we would normally understand by objectively true ethical judgments. On ethical relativism, you could say a person makes a true judgment if they accurately describe the morality of their culture, but if somebody is from a different culture, then that they can make the opposite statement and it can still be true. So in that sense, it's not the normal sense of ethical objectivity. Now, what should we say about this view, about cultural relativism? There's two questions that you ought to distinguish. There's cultural relativism as a descriptive claim about the way the world is, and there's cultural relativism as a normative claim, or what you might think of as a purely ethical claim about what we ought to do and how we ought to live. Let me say a little bit more about that distinction. So, descriptive cultural relativism is the statement that different cultures have different moralities, different ethical views. So let's look at that first. Is it true or false? Well, when Europeans started exploring different cultures at various times in past centuries, so particularly in the 18th and 19th century, as they moved out, anthropologists started observing these societies and reported all sorts of differences. For example, there were quite dramatic differences about sexual morality. In some societies, people were polygamous. Men had more than one wife. And in a much smaller number of societies, women had more than one husband. And that seemed somewhat shocking to the Europeans who discovered this. Or perhaps even was claimed they regarded sex as not wrong when people were not married at all. Even more shocking. And then there were a variety of other practices. For example, cannibalism, the eating of people whom you captured, was accepted as right and normal in some cultures. And the Eskimo or Inuit people were famous for allegedly killing their elderly parents, or allowing their elderly parents to die at least, when they were unable to move with the nomadic group according to the seasons. So parricide and matricide seemed to be acceptable in these societies. So there was a lot of emphasis on these differences. And certainly there are some differences, but even from these examples, even from the last example, you can perhaps see that, well, maybe they're just because in different circumstances people have to behave differently. If, for instance, you need to move with the seasons or you're going to starve, and if people become too weak and old to travel with the group, what are you going to do? You have to leave them if leaving them to starve is kinder than killing them, well, you have to do one or the other anyway. So you could say, this is not really a difference. We would do the same if our survival depended on it. It's simply saying that the survival of the larger group is more important than the survival of one or two elderly individuals. And so you have to do that. And maybe that's not a deep moral difference. The other thing that we've become more aware of, I guess, over the last 40 or 50 years, is the common features that extend across different societies. So, for example, I don't think you can find a society in which there isn't some rule of reciprocity. That is, there isn't some rule that if somebody does a favour to you, in some way you ought to return the favour. Whereas on the other hand, if somebody does something nasty to you, then it's okay for you to do something nasty to them. Now, that's not absolutely universal. You might think, for instance, of the Christian idea of turning the other cheek. But in practice, while you might think that's a noble ideal, it's certainly, if you were just observing the societies that say they're Christian, if you're observing them as an anthropologist, you wouldn't say that it's standard that when somebody hits people on the cheek or anywhere and it hits them anywhere, they just allow themselves to be hit and go on their way. They don't. So this seems to be this idea of, you could say tit for tat, of doing good to others who do good to you, but perhaps doing bad to those who do bad to you, or certainly not doing good, does seem to be pretty much universal. The idea that parents have obligations to their children, or at least that mothers have obligations to their children. It's not quite so universal perhaps that fathers do, though it's certainly very general. That's also something which seems to be pretty much universal. And the reason for that, a lot of people will say now, is because there are some biological factors here. Morality is not purely cultural. It's influenced by the fact that we have evolved over millions of years as mammals, as social mammals, living in groups. And the groups don't do well. People don't do well if they don't cooperate. And to cooperate, you need some element of reciprocity. You need people to be returning good for good. Otherwise, people won't cooperate with you. And if mothers don't care for their offspring, well, obviously the offspring are going to die. They need to be fed by someone, and there's not always someone else around who can feed the child if the mother is not going to do so. So, is descriptive ethical relativism true? Yeah, yes and no. There are some differences, but there are certainly some universals. So that's interesting and maybe relevant to some of the things that we're concerned about. But of greater importance for our course is whether normative ethical relativism is true, whether it's true that the right thing to do is what your culture or your morality says ought to be done. And if you think about this, I think it becomes obvious fairly quickly that this is not the case, that we don't accept this, that we don't accept that in cultures in which slavery was practiced, that it was right to have slaves. We make some excuses for people who have slaves. We sort of, think about some of the founding fathers of this nation who we regard as honourable people, like Jefferson or Washington, and we think about, but they were slave owners. So we make excuses for them. We may say, well, given the pressures of their time, given the way people thought about relations between people of European descent and people of African descent at that time, it's understandable perhaps that they didn't reject this institution, but we still think of it as something not great. As I say, we make excuses, but we still think really they would have been better people if they had said slavery is wrong, I'm not going to be a slave owner anymore, I'm going to free my slaves. I think we admire those people who, living in the southern states of the US, did that at a time when slavery was the prevalent practice. We don't say, oh, no, they were bad people because they did something contrary to their culture. And I think we feel the same about many other cases. Cultures that we've had some, for example, examples of parts of Pakistan where there are honour killings, where if a woman is raped, the family think that it's such a shame, that it's such a disgrace to them that their daughter was raped, that their response is to kill her. We think that that's completely wrong, and obviously we would think that even no matter how much you're in that culture, you would be a much better person if you didn't act that way. So when you think about it, I don't think this is a very appealing kind of position intuitively. And a lot of people support it because they think it makes us more tolerant. They support it because they reject the idea of Western imperialism, which certainly was the practice, that people from Europe went out and colonised other countries and imposed their morality on them. And we think that that was not a great thing to do, and we think if only they'd been cultural relativists, they would have been more tolerant. But in fact, that doesn't really hold when you think about the implications of what cultural relativism means. A British general called Charles Napier was in India at the time when India was, early days of India as a British colony, helped conquer parts of India. And as British extended their rule over India, they banned the practice of sutti. Sutti was a practice where if your husband died, you were under enormous pressure to, if he died, his body would be burnt on a funeral pyre, to throw yourself into the flames and incinerate yourself. Men did not have to do this if their wives died. Only women had to do this. And basically they were forced to do, sometimes they would do so more or less willingly, accepting the culture, but if not, they were more or less forced to do so. So the British banned it, and a delegation of Indians came to see General Napier, and they said, look, this is our custom. You are acting contrary to our custom. And he said, well, fine, you have your custom, but in my country, when men burn women to death, it's our custom to hang them. So you practice your custom, we'll practice our custom. Obviously, the practice eventually stopped, and I think most people today would agree that it was a very good thing that the practice stopped. So I don't think that cultural relativism really even achieves what people wanted it to achieve. I don't think it's a proper basis for even defending the idea that we ought to be tolerant to other cultures and we ought not to impose our views on them, because that itself is a moral claim, and if you're in a culture which is by its nature imperialist, then you haven't got a claim against the person coming from that culture.